Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning from other global regions. Welcome to this webinar. With me on the call, you will see us, Erdem, and George Uzi. We will be discussing today the relation between the 27001-02, the enterprise security frameworks, with a specific focus on the cybersecurity one, which is covered by the 27032. And as next part of the discussions, Als and George will explain also how this relates to the CMMC framework, which has been launched quite a while ago to maintain cybersecurity, but I'll leave it up to them actually to start implementing it. You probably have seen me already before in some of the other webinars focusing on the implementation of ISO 27001 cybersecurity data protection. So, Als, are you ready to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, this is Als Erdem, and I'm the consultant speaker and trainer for the cybersecurity, data privacy, and business continuity management, as well as the export control and sanctions here in the US. I'm based out of Florida. So we will cover the CMMC topics and also a little bit about the NIST 800-171 standard and partially NIST SP 800-53 standard, and how the defense contractors can comply with these regulations, upcoming rule, etc. So you'll talk about the documentation and assessment process. Well, thank you.
Good. Thanks, George. Up to you.
I'm George Uzi. I am a GRC and cybersecurity expert here in the US. I'm actually in California, so quite early in the morning for me, but not too early. And my focus is CMMC as well as cross-mapping to other frameworks. And I'll be talking a little bit about the CMMC as well as ISO and how you might put together a compliance program for that.
Good. Before we start, a bit of the agenda, I will kicking off a bit of the introduction on the relations between the frameworks, and then give you the introduction to the CMMC, which will be covered by Als and George. Just first of all, you should all have the access to the panel, the questions and answers panel. Depending on the number of questions, we might not be able during this session to answer all the questions, but still I would highly encourage you to submit your questions in the chat windows, because we will get a list of the questions, and what we will do later on is collect the answers. George, Als and I will actually answer all of them. We will publish them. And then we will put it on a LinkedIn page. Also, that same LinkedIn page will be provided to you, and you can easily find it on my profile. If there is any additional material that might be interesting to investigate, to get some access to some interesting links on the internet, we will provide information, and depending on the questions, we will provide some extra references and information on the page. And last but not least, the people that were not able to join today, it's good to know that the session is recorded. You will get access to the recorded video, and also the presentation itself will be published later on by BCB, so you can always go back to the presentation and the section of today. Good. So we will discuss the ISO 27001. Then, as George and Als mentioned, we will go into the discussion with what CMMC is, what is the current status of it. And then in the last part number 3, we will do some risk assessment and selection of frameworks, and discuss a bit in that sense. And part number 4 is, of course, the Q&A. So we were planning to have more or less an hour, and then we have plenty of time still to answer your questions. And as mentioned, if your question is not being answered directly in the presentation today, you will get an answer offline. We will take care actually that all the questions are being answered today. Okay. Good. First of all, a quick introduction to understand the CMMC. It's quite interesting, first of all, to know a bit about the ISO standards. First of all, very important to know, ISO standards globally managed by the ISO organizations is a set of best practices being implemented. What we are focusing on today is rather on the information security and all the other standards derived from that master plan in that sense. And a very important part to understand from the ISO approach is that mainly the ISO standards are based on the plan, do, check, act cycle. So planning first, then executing according to plan, checking the items, providing metrics, and then depending on the deviations or the improvement plans, we're going to restart the cycle depending on the feedback of the previous cycle. And that's very important to know. So it's a gradual system, very important to improve your security continuously. And you will see that the structure of these standards is built in that sense, having some management clauses, and then specifically to the ISO 27000 series. You will also see that there are some measures and controls being implemented in the annex, and that's exactly what we're going to discuss today. Please be aware that the ISO 27001 is rather a global or a high-level framework or a standard focusing on information security management system. In one of the next few slides, I will show you a bit that actually is a family of standards covering diverse topics, including data protection, including privacy. And it's quite important to know that the standard, first of all, in high level is based on the ISO 9000. The plan to check act cycle is covered in the clauses, providing you some help actually to get the support of the management team of the company, providing a continuous improvement, including monitoring and audits. The second part of the ISO 27001 is the table of the annex, and it's quite important to know in the current version, which has been lately published in 2022 with an update, we now have 93 controls defined in the annex, which actually should cover the implementation of the standards by mainly 4 big subcategories: people management, policy management, technical management, and the physical management, so PPT plus the P for physical. And very important to know, in essence, if you want to know what all these controls are about, you can actually look into the companion guide or the implementation by the ISO 27002, which is the guidance extra for implementations. To put it very short, every control that is being mentioned in the ISO 27001 as the audit standard or the control standard is being supported by a page of information in 27002, which can be very handy to select or to discover a few options for every single measure or control being mentioned in the ISO 27001. As you know, in the title for the session of today, we also mentioned the 27032, which is a cybersecurity standard, actually as a part of one of the technology standards within the ISO 27001 family. Please be aware that cybersecurity is a small part actually of information security in global. To cut a bit of the corners, actually, information security is about protecting your company, and any business data actually is being covered. So we will see over here, as showed in the diagrams, it's rather a large part of activities that you should cover in the 27001, covering the clauses and annexes. But the cybersecurity itself is rather focusing on the internet connected activities. Cloud can be part of it. So it's a rather smaller subsection of the ISO 27001, and other standards will be covering a bit of the small topics within the global framework actually of the 2701. Just for your information, the ISO 2701 is a global standard, and you might see that there is quite some input from regional frameworks, and one of the most important ones that will be discovered and covered today is also the NIST, and the NIST is NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is the US governmental organization actually that is providing standards in the US, which has provided quite some interesting frameworks to help you out in implementing these best practices. And one of the specific topics of the day will be the CSF, which is the cybersecurity framework, which is in most of the cases rather a highly detailed documentation that you will get from the NIST, as they are sponsored by the US government, which is a slightly different approach as what the ISO organization does. They get their money and their budget actually from selling the standards as documentation. The ISO 2701 series is not in conflict with the NIST documentation. It's quite important to know. They rather are complementary to each other, while the ISO 27000 documents are rather high level, focused on the PDCA cycle. The NIST documentation will provide you with detailed explanations, detailed checklists and information. So once you know the basic principles, you can easily dive into the NIST documentation. That's exactly what George and Os will explain later on in these sessions, right? To give you a bit of an overview, what are the typical family of standards? First of all, on the left-hand side, you see actually the clauses, the management responsibilities. As you see, going from the context over the leadership responsibilities, we're going to the implementation and the support, and very important, also the auditing and the performance measuring is in clause 9, and then we close the cycle and start over again with clause number 10, the continuous improvement. Each of them are also supported with substandards, for example, auditing standards, governance standards, and the entire PDCA cycle, for example, is being discussed in the ISO 9000, so it might be quite interesting to have a look at it to increase your understanding of the basic management principles in the ISO standards. On the right-hand side, you see rather the complex environment in the annex. Right now, we have 15 operational capabilities. Remember, in the past, in ISO 2713 version, we had subgroups based on departmental functions, including development, legal department, operations department, and network department, for example. That has slightly changed, although that if you see the operational capabilities as they are being used right now in the new standard, are pretty much alike. In the past, we had 14 modules, now we have 15, and there is an increased focus in the new ISO 2701 2022 versions for cloud security, cybersecurity, and data protections. By the way, in the middle, on the top, you see the privacy framework or data protection. On the bottom, you see actually, and that's what we're going to focus on today, rather the focus on cybersecurity frameworks. And this session is rather focused on the cybersecurity implementation. So yeah, there's the link between the cybersecurity. Very important, and that's something also that people do not know. Also keep in mind that ISO is developing a separate cybersecurity framework. I mentioned a few of the upcoming standards into this. So not only having the 27000 series, but now ISO is building a package of upcoming standards, new standards on cybersecurity on the 27100 series, and it's not that difficult to understand because, for example, privacy frameworks is covered by the 29100, and so pretty similar. You will see new standards popping up in the 27100 series. Right now, 27103, 27110. And more are coming up to support actually what we'll be discussing today. Good. Yeah, a bit more details in this one, so have a look at it. You will see that lots of new things are popping up. as an addition to support ISO 27032, which is the an add-on actually for the ISO 27100 series. Sorry, the 27001 series. Just a quick note, if you're looking into certification, also know that these substandards, as mentioned over here, for example, 27032, but also 2717 or 33 or 18, for example, for cloud security, are not certifiable. You can add them for the implementation. You can include them in the management system. But only the 27001 or the 27701, which is the PIM systems, are certifiable under the certification of the ISO organizations, and that's slightly different as what the CMMC is actually doing. Just as a hint, just a practical thing, if you want to compare the standards or if you want to compare other global standards, have a look at the Secure Controls Framework. It's for free, it's open source. So a bunch or a group of specialists is maintaining this framework on a regular basis. The good news is also, and you will see some introduction in that sense by George and by Oz. It's also referring to the maturity model, so it's explaining per control, per implementations, what is expected from the CMMI model, meaning the capability model to implement, and it helps you actually to estimate the maturity of your systems to do a gap analysis. It's for free, it's open source, and you see the link. Go check for the SCF download link. You can actually have a Excel file there and then look into it, and you will be surprised to see how many global standards, sector standards, national standards are being implemented. If I'm not mistaken, I think there's a comparison between 300 security standards available globally, so it might be an interesting point to check afterwards with comparison to the CMMC. Good. Also very important, please be aware that the ISO 27001 is not just a checklist, but is rather a maturity model. So it allows you to implement the various controls we will be implementing in stages. So there's no obligation to implement it all at once, and that's exactly what makes it very interesting to compare these stages. And the same thing will apply also to the NIST approach and what you will see. Right? Very important to know, as I mentioned before, ISO is rather a global organization. Many of these standards are being built on a national or regional level, and then will be adopted on a global information. It's a rather high level implementations, while the NIST standards are mainly US based. And are also sponsored by the US government. Main advantage in that sense is that they provide a highly detailed implementation. So as I told you before, it might be quite interesting actually to discover a bit of the global standards with a general framework, the bit of the implementation, global practices, and then diving into NIST documentation as an add-on to dive into more detailed implementations. Before I hand over the word actually to George and Oz, also very important, please be aware, also you might have noticed that PCB also has published quite recently NIS2, and please be aware NIS is actually the security legislation in Europe for critical infrastructure, the cybersecurity legislation, so it's not NIST but NIS. And actually, Europe is pushing a lot into increasing security of cyber activities and cyber offerings in that sense. Still, it has been published 2 years ago and will be activated officially in October this year. Please be aware, one important thing which is relevant for this session is that actually the NIS2 legislation, the directive that is being published on European level, in many cases will be implemented or built based on global standards, and many of the cybersecurity authorities will refer to NIST or the ISO standards, and one of the first ones being published is the Belgian CCB, which is the Cybersecurity Center in Belgium. has been published, the Cyber Fundamentals Framework. By the way, it will be supported by certification and accreditation, so it might be helpful actually to look into it. Don't be surprised that you will see lots of NIST principles being mentioned into that one, because they are very practical, globally accepted also. So you will see that actually lots of these frameworks and implementations, even on European side, will be hooking up the NIST principles, and you will discover also quite some similarities as what is being discussed in the CMMC in the different levels and the different types of implementation, the level of maturity in that sense. Just for your information, if you want to have a look into it, you can have a look at the Lead Cybersecurity Manager course or the NIST Lead Implementer course. The Lead Cybersecurity Manager course has been recently refreshed last year to match the new standards of the ISO 27032. Good. Yeah, very important. You will see that actually these standards will be using the NIST CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework principles, and I will leave it up to us and George now actually to takes the next part of the presentation, because this is what they're going to explain exactly in detail. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you. And first of all, good afternoon and good evening to our guests joining us from Europe and Asia, and good morning to the folks joining here from the United States. I want to take a step back a little bit here, because before diving into these standards, we need to understand the definitions, of course, the definitions of the federal contract information and controlled unclassified information. These are the, FCI and CUI. I'm going to keep referring to three pieces of legislation here. The first one is the Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 2002. That's the regulations that are maintained by the NARA, National Archives. That's the first one, because that clearly defines the CUI, the Controlled Unclassified Information, when it comes to all these NIST standards here. And then the next one is the Title 48 Federal Acquisition Regulations. That's the piece of regulations that really talks about how to procure something, product or services to the US government. And there we have the definition of the FCI, Federal Contract Information. And finally, when it comes to the CUI, the Covered Defense Information, CDI, that is specific to Department of Defense, and that definition is provided, and all other regulations that we will keep talking in the next couple of slides. And it's in the DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations Supplement. That's 48, again, CFR Part 252. So there are three pieces of subparts there. We will talk about that. So essentially, there is a chronology of this. First, there was an FCI, Federal Contract Information, was defined for the government business, right, for the US government business. And then executive order back in 2010 by the president at that time came out, Executive Order 13566. That defined the controlled unclassified information and what type of safeguard against dissemination control should exist for controlled unclassified information. That task was delegated to National Archives, and National Archives contacted the executive agencies to create the list and categories of the CUI. So it's critical for you to where to look if you're looking at the, my type of my information at the moment that I'm handling here or storing or processing. Is it really CUI or not? The best place to go is the CUI registry that we can share, of course, the links right after this webinar. And that's the CUI registry maintained by the National Archives that's available on the web. Now, after this, of course, we have this NIST standards defined, right? The NIST is, as Peter said, is a government agency. It's under the Department of Commerce here in the US, and it has multiple standards to control the safeguard and dissemination of the CUI. So the first one, for instance, that you see on this slide, NIST Special Publication SP 800-53 that we are using the revision 5 at the moment. and that is essentially the security and privacy standard for US federal information systems. That is excluding those that are related to national security. This standard is supporting the FedRAMP moderate mainly, and FedRAMP is a concept. It's a federal risk and authorization management program, again created by the U.S. government. So it has around 325 controls in that 853 standard. So the cloud service providers have to basically comply with the standard, and also authorize under the FedRAMP program, depending on what they're offering. But typically 80% of the cloud service providers are under the moderate baseline. This is mainly for federal systems, right? Now, how you're going to handle the CUI or store or generate the CUI on non-federal systems, then you have to comply with the NIST, again, SP, Special Publication 800-171. And now we are using revision 2, and now we're celebrating that revision 3 is approaching in horizon. Of course, some people are not happy with the increased number of controls. But essentially, what this standard does is it shows all the controls and the objectives with a lot of discussion points. You can take a look at the assessment guide for the 800-171, and that is 800-171A. And so it creates, or it defines 14 security families and 110 controls in there. These are the ones that are mainly today used by the defense contractors to implement. In order to handle, store, or generate the CUI on their own or control systems. Now, 800-172 is the other one. So it's essentially what it does is it's a security standard for non-federal contractor systems, right? But it has more enhanced, security requirements inside, more toward the advanced persistent threats, APTs, and it has again 14 security families, and plus, in addition to the 171, it has also 35 enhanced controls. Who is going to use this? Well, we will define it, but essentially this 172 standard will be used by those organizations that are accessing to high-value sensitive CUI going forward under this new proposed rule. Let's go to the next slide, Peter.
Yeah, but before we move to the next one, just as a comparison, it's very nice to see the 853 revision 5 to that one. It's very much comparable to the 27001 ISO standards, just for comparison, while the ISO 27001 has I think 27 or 30 slides. The ISO of the NIST SP 853 document is containing 483 pages. So you see how it works together with the ISO series in that sense. Also for architects and ISO implementers, it can be quite interesting actually to combine them with the ISO standards. Okay.
Absolutely.
Go, George.
Yep. Okay, so we talked about evolution, right? So how did all start? So basically, we are going back to like 2010, 2012. First, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement rule was introduced. If you remember, I was talking about the executive agencies are defining their sensitive information. So let me put it this way: organizations might have classified information. These are completely out of our scope. We're not talking about the national security related classified information here. That would require a US security clearance, but we're talking about anything and everything else here. So unclassified, but potentially sensitive, declared by the organization which owns it or which generates it. So all government agencies came with their own CUIs. That would be the Treasury Department, Immigration Department, Department of Health, and DOD, of course, one of them, the leading example. So DOD defined these regulations under the DFARS. So anytime you're gonna sell product or service or part of the government contract, government project, especially I'm talking about the DOD here, they define two things. In addition to the CUI definition, these are control technical information and covered defense information. So 7-12 will describe these. So what they say in a nutshell, that covered defense information would be in two form or shape, right? The first one would be the CUI that is defined by DoD, and in the contract they say, well, this is a CUI for me, so safeguarded properly. And it might be also the CTI, control technical information, and these are typically the having a technical nature, and would be in military or aerospace domain mainly. And in many cases, if it is issued by the DoD, that might also be subject to the export control regulations, such as ITAR. Now, so this piece of regulation is defining these two, plus it brings two responsibilities now to all prime contractors and their subcontractors. First is all these prime defense contractors and their subs have to comply with the NIST 800-171 or be FedRAMP moderate certified, right? So you have to comply with them, and you have to self-assess yourself. That I'm talking about back in 2015, and by January 1st of 2018, it was already mandatory. Now, the second one is the cyber incident reporting. So if the contractor figured out that there is a cyber breach or cyber incident is happening or happened, right? From the moment that they realized this, they had 72 hours to report it to DIBnet, which is the Defense Industrial Base specific platform, to report this breach. And finally, as the defense contractors, you're supposed to flow down in the contracts to your subcontractors all these responsibilities that you see here. So 7-12 is describing them. Then, in 1 or 2 years, actually in 2018, 2019, now you're talking about CMMC version 1. The concept was defined. What is CMMC? It's a cybersecurity maturity model certification. And what DoD said, so they contracted with an organization called, at that time it was CMMC Accreditation Board. Now they renamed Cyber Accreditation Board. The first release of that was saying that the certification will be required before the contract, and they gave a deadline of 2025 January 1st to basically see those requirements in the contracts. So no self-assessment anymore. Third-party certification will be required. And in the first release, we had 5 levels of the CMMC. I'm not going to go into the details because it's really history now. Then what happened was, we are talking about 2019 and 2020 again, or maybe 2021 early. A new 2 rules came out, and actually 3 rules, 70-19, 70-20, and 70-21, again under the DFARS 252-204. So what it said, well, in the interim time, until we cook the CMMC idea entirely and come up with the final rule, the companies, all defense contractors and their subs must do the basic assessment, self-assessment, and upload their score to the SPRS. That's again the DoD's Defense Contract Management Agency, specifically a supplier performance risk system. So create your system security plan. If there are gaps and deficiency, have a plan of actions and milestones, and then put your score, self-score on that website. Now the flow down clause again is in there. It also introduced the medium and high assessment rule, which is medium and high assessment must be done by the DoD. 70-21 was like the concept of CMMC for the first time occurred in the regulations, but through time now, proposed rule, which we'll cover in the next slide, is stating that now you have 3 levels, which we've been discussing these 3 levels already for 2 years, because that's the new version, right? CMMC version 2, it came with level 1, level 2, and level 3. Now it's the proposed rule, and I'll discuss the details in the next slide. So what it says is, I don't know if we really didn't define the definition. We didn't give the definitions yet, but again, CUI is basically, as defined in the registry, right? It's a piece of information that is created or possessed by the government, or as the prime contractor or subcontractors, you can create or possess that information which is related to a contract. In the first place, that contract or the receivable from the government was marked or labeled as CUI, controlled unclassified information. again, just to refresh, these are not classified, these are unclassified, but these are sensitive to that issuing agency. Now, DoD again is leading example here. We don't know who is going to follow, right? So, but it's growing. It's growing is the certification model. But at the moment, it's a DoD cybersecurity assessment model. It will be mandatory in most contracts by the expected time frame is the first half of next year. It's pretty much delayed. We were expecting this, proposal like 6 months ago, even 9 months ago. We just waited. Now it's published in last month in December 2023. What it does, it's adding the part 170 to title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Under this title, you see there Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. So yeah, there was a gap in the system, right? When they were basically doing the, giving authority to the contractors to self-assess themselves. Yes, there is False Claims Act in the United States. So basically, you cannot self-score yourself and put some false scores there. The top score is 110 because you have to comply with 110 NIST 800-171 security requirements. That's the top score. Many companies were actually just were not sure about how to score correctly, and they were putting 110 or pretty high scores. So the government now says that, or the DoD says, you cannot self-assess anymore. There is very limited scope for the self-assessment. You're going to have to go through the third-party assessment and the government assessment for most of the contracts. And introduced 3 certification levels. Level 1 for the basic, level 2 is for expert, and level 3 is for advanced. And also, what this proposed rule brought us is a lot of guidances. It's over 230 pages of regulations we are talking about here, and we're still trying to go over it. And the guidance includes major concepts of the CMMC, the ecosystem. What is ecosystem? There are many stakeholders here. First of all, the project management office of the DoD, right? Or any given organization eventually, right? If Homeland Security or Department of Energy are going to adopt this. DIPCAC, so it's the Defense Industry Base Cybersecurity Accreditation office here, and also Cyber AB, right? Cyber AB is the Cyber Accreditation Board, and there's a CAICO underneath, and CAICO is essentially the cybersecurity assessor and instructor certification organization again. And C3PAOs, too many right now. Companies here in the US, assessor organizations are applying to be a certified third-party assessor organization, and there are, I think 50 or 60 are already approved by the Cyber AB. We have certified professionals, we have certified assessors, licensed training providers, licensed content providers, LPPs here. And scoping, extremely critical in the CMMC, assessment and hashing. These are the other things, other guidances that are introduced in this proposed rule. Peter?
So I would add to that as well, and just to give people an idea of the so if we could go back to the that other slide, please, just for a second before. On the C3PAO, what's interesting is that in order to become certified, they are requiring that the organizations that receive C3PAO are ISO 27001 certified as well, which is not relatively new, but new enough to cite that ISO is a big part of the equation for auditors. Go ahead, Oz.
Okay, so we said 3 levels. So let's get into the details a little bit. I mentioned the federal contract information, but I didn't really give the definition of that. I talked about the CUI, right? CUI is more sensitive. Federal contract information is kind of less sensitive, but it's basically any contract-related information or any information related to contract, in other words, that you receive from the US government and you share with the subcouncil, etc., or you just work on that. Only exceptions would be publicly available information. So for instance, and also the very simple financial transaction-related information, right? So you are a contractor, defense contractor, or any other government contractor, and you receive contract information. you would probably expect to see that that would be the FCI. You know, you don't have to see that it's marked somewhere, but you should treat it as the FCI, unless it is published somewhere on their websites, on the government's website. You know, the bidding type of documents, sometimes the RFPs, etc., would be publicly available, so they wouldn't be FCI, but anything beyond that would be. So under the new proposed rule, the contractors have to have a level 1 certification. Basically, it's a self-assessment. You don't need to invite the certified third-party assessor organizations, C3PAOs. You can certainly invite them for helping you, your company, but essentially it might be done a self-assessment, and you do not have to have a particular document for it, like the system security plan or plan of actions and milestones. Self-assessment scores, again, are going to have to be reported on the SPRS system. And there's 17 easy practices. I'm saying it's 17 easy, but really, you know, from our perspective, but for many small businesses, we know it's a challenge to put together those 17 cybersecurity practices in place. They are in alignment with the 15 requirements that are outlined in the Part 52.204-21. Now, level 2 is a little bit more complicated. If you're going to have to receive, store, handle, and generate controlled unclassified information, then now you have to have a level 2 certification. There are 2 ways of doing this. You will have to have a either self-certification or C3PAO certification in most of the cases. Self-certifications really are allowed by the DoD in only selected programs, you know, unprioritized acquisitions mainly, but in most of the cases, I think the number is around 90–95% of the programs. That's expected that the companies should have the C3PAO certifications in every 3 years. And in addition to that, you know, they have to again go to the SPRS system and annually update their scores. Now, what they have to comply with is the 800.171 standard, revision 2 as of today. As I mentioned, we have 110 practices, and it's again in alignment with the 252.204.7012 that we discussed in the previous slides. In some, well, before going to level 3, I can say level 2 would apply to most of the CUIs that are handled today. Level 3 is recently defined, and it will be necessary if the company is going to receive, store, handle, or generate sensitive, high value, in other words, controlled unclassified information. And who is going to define it? Only the DoD will tell you. You know, the contract office will tell you if it is a sensitive or high value CUI. Now, in order to handle this or store that type of information, you will have to have the DoD certification. And it's again triennial, every 3 years have to be renewed. And there are the basic requirements that you have to have a level 2 certification, or in other words, level 2 requirements have to be implemented first, and then 24 selected security requirements of the 800.172. That's the other standard, you know, with the enhanced security requirements. They, you know, the contractors have to implement those for in order to get the level 3. Now, senior officials of prime contractors and all subcontractors are required to affirm continuing compliance initially and annually. So that's very critical, and that's a new requirement. E1. Okay, the CMMC documentation. So what are those? Well, 2 critical documentation. One of them is absolutely necessary. The other one is in case it's needed, right? System security plan. You have to define the system security plan as the contractor first. If you are shooting for level 2 and level 3, not needed for level 1. What it does, it describes those 110 requirements or 134 requirements, depending on what level you're looking for, and then your procedures or your way of handling or implementing them has to be part of the system security plan. Or system security plan can be a tinier document, smaller document, but referring all these, you know, procedures to an external document. That's totally okay and encouraged. Now, system security plan at minimum should have the network diagram, environment, as well as the asset inventory either inside or as an external, because these 3 pieces, asset inventory, system security plan, and network diagram are the three very critical documents that assessors are going to look first. Plan of actions and milestones, POAM. So that's the document when there are gaps and deficiencies. I'm talking about now the certification process. It will be only allowed if minimal score is 0.8 out of 1, right? So, or in other words, 88 of the requirements at minimum were implemented correctly. And POAM is not going to be allowed for controls that have weight more than 1, like 3 or 5 scores, 3 or 5 points, or if the specific requirement is ineligible for POAM. So if you fail it, there is no POAM. Basically, you just fail the certification. So these are critical things to know, you know, before moving forward with certification. 180 days of the POAM and senior leadership approval are required on these documents, especially SSP and POAM. So keep that in mind. Signature, date, broadcast of that information that this document was approved to the correct individuals. These are the things that assessors are going to be looking for. Next one, Peter. So quickly, I'm going to talk about the assessment and certification process, what contractors need to do and what their subcontractors need to do in order to be CMMC certified. And you're getting ready for assessment, right? The very first thing you need to do is defining the boundary. Define your system environment. If you have a large system, you know, network, you do not have to really be certified for all of it. Specifically design where the CUI flows, how it flows, right? Who receives it and how you handle it, where you store, what servers, what workstations, what you know, medias you store CUI. Just put your boundaries around it and say, these are my in-scope elements, in-scope environments that I'm going to go for the CMMC. Because if you have large systems and in some of those parts you're not handling the CUI, it's kind of overkill to put everything under the certification process. Just create your boundary for that. What is in scope? What is out of scope? Identify them. Identify your assets. As I mentioned, you need to create your asset inventory. Identify all the hardware, software, you know, firmware, etc., technology assets, people assets. These are very critical. And are they FCI or are they CUI related assets? You need to identify them. Find out where are your security protection assets, such as firewalls, you know, AV, antivirus systems, etc. Your DMZ zones. All these need to be defined in your boundary. Contractor risk managed assets are other assets that don't really necessarily handle the CUR or FCI, but potentially maybe handling. There are specific requirements that you have to keep that in mind. Always try to, you have to make those part of your SSP. Specialized assets are in scope for CUI, not in scope for FCI. These are the IoT devices, operating technology devices, and government properties. And then, of course, out of scope assets. Once you have done these, seek for the certification. You know, contact the C3PAOs or contact DoD for level 3, and then, you know, expect the agreement, contracts, etc. Once it's signed, go ahead and do this. If needed, they will help you to put the POAM. You will define your POAM. They will review it, and you have 180 days to close out your POAMs in order to pass. If you cannot, then you will fail the certification essentially. And then we will submit the score to SPRS system, senior official affirmation. That's pretty much it. This is the assessment process. I'm sure you will have lots of questions about that, but we'll try to cover this right after the webinar. Thank you. I think back to you, George.
All right. Thank you, Oz. So we're going to be covering what essentially are 4 points here. Knowing that we have a limited amount of time, my section is relatively short, so it leaves room for question and answer. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to start about executive support. So I think a lot of you are really getting into the details of how some of these frameworks work, but specifically you're understanding how to actually implement. But the challenge is making sure that you have executives supporting you as well as other departments. And so we have essentially 2 sets of 3 slides that are kind of an idea of how you garner that executive support. Really, we're talking more so about the cyber laws and the situation of getting hacked and how executive accountability comes into that. If you walk into an executive's office with a bunch of technical terms, you're going to have some challenges. So first slide, cyber laws are looming, and we all know that it's generally, that means sanctions. It can also mean lost contracts. Executives often, they don't understand cybersecurity or the difference between cybersecurity and information security. So your responsibility is to explain that to them. But what's really going to drive them is an understanding of how there are requirements that will become barriers to contracts. When we use the generic term cyber laws, it can mean all regulations, but they're looking for simple terms. And then if they want more detail, you can get into more detail with them. Next slide, please. So a good message to executives is that getting hacked is a matter of when. At one point, we used to say there are companies that have been hacked and companies that will be hacked. Now we say there are companies that have been hacked and companies that don't know they have been hacked. And so that gets the point across to executives, and whether or not a compromise is privacy relevant or classified information relevant is obviously our responsibility, but making sure that leaders know that these folks are hard to stop, and thus the cyber laws. Next slide. And here's the point, is that all executives are accountable. So specifically in the US, we're kind of seeing a lot more state data privacy legislation. Our federal privacy legislation didn't quite get there, so to speak. So things like CPRA, CCPA, VCTPA, and a number of others. That's not the topic here today, but we get into frameworks, generally speaking, when we're looking at CMMC, there are accountability issues, and one that really concerns us is not necessarily the hack, but a situation where we see a lot of smaller businesses that have signed contracts and they hadn't been paying attention to the detail in those contracts, and now they're subject to the False Claims Act. This is a serious problem for these smaller businesses, and we're not talking about sophisticated businesses. And many of you, I imagine, are probably working for a smaller business, looking at us saying, wow, look at all that expertise. We really know it all and that sort of thing. How do I get there? But the challenge really is what does your business need to do and how do you do it? And so if you're faced with just one framework, it's hard enough, but imagine having more than one and then figuring out how to bring those together and then deal with privacy laws and deal with revenue teams. So the driver for executives, though, the second slide you would show to them is we have click one more time. This is got an animation. The growing US data privacy laws. So back in April of 2023, there were just a few states. If you click one more time, that should bring you to what essentially is January 12th of 2024. And so this gets executives paying attention. This also will help you get funding. So it's not necessarily just about the frameworks, but it indicates to executives that there's more accountability than just the frameworks that we're focused on. Next slide, please. And then, of course, international data privacy laws that we're all familiar with. So next slide, please, Peter. So those 6 slides were really more for executives to kind of understand them. Why do I need this funding? How do I move forward? There's much more to it than that, but those are generally the things that resonate with them to get their attention, especially in the US. So we have to make sure that we also explain to them there's the common term that leaders are familiar with is cybersecurity. They don't use information security here anymore in day-to-day language at the executive level. Even though we understand there's differences, they don't. So this is a slide to help them understand that that there's this new evolution, and we call basically the cybersecurity ground warrior, explaining to them that, listen, I've got all these technical things to do. I've got frameworks to cover. I've got controls to deal with. There's a new, and that's just me trying to be reactive. These frameworks, as well as these privacy laws and these things that we're talking about, this is kind of more of the air war, and this is proving for when you have these regulations or even lawmakers that are pursuing these organizations. That's more the business side, and of course, as we know it, we have we have essentially that separation of external context versus internal context in the ISO 27005, and understanding what your internal versus your external environment looks like. So this goes into the executive side as well, and what other frameworks you have to address. Next slide, please. So this is what you have to explain to your team as well. So this is more so for teams. And that is the reality that cybersecurity is really more about the technical protection from hackers. We call it the cybersecurity compliance of tech. And whereas data privacy laws, risks, regulations, and these frameworks are more like framework governance function, is the governance and risk of business. And often you're walking into these situations talking about the C, compliance and cybersecurity, compliance and cybersecurity. Again, very US-based thinking in that regards, in terms of terminology as well. And so they have to understand that the governance and the risk side, or what we call GRC, of compliance program deployment, automation, and upkeep becomes critical, because you're not always just looking at ISO 27001 or just looking at CMMC these days. Perhaps for smaller business, that's the case. But there's a cascading privacy laws that you have to deal with as well. And so having the program together is important. Next slide, please. So this one comes straight out of the brand new, well, 3-month-old, 4-month-old, a certified CISO course from PECB, and the idea of a compliance program. And the reason I bring this up is because this is the slide that resonated with me when I went through this course when it was newly launched in October at the PECB conference in France. And you know, essentially, these programs are a set of processes, policies, procedures, and controls. More so, we're so focused on the controls that we forget that there's business processes and business policies that are outside of the silo of data protection or even cybersecurity, and you have to make sure that you don't miss those things. And this is where the governance and risk management components come in. But this is how you're establishing policies. So my suggestion for those of you that haven't seen the course is to, this is an important course, because it's going to teach you the risk management process. It's going to teach you different types of frameworks. It's not just ISO focused. It's going to look at all kinds of data privacy laws, and it's going to teach you how to be more leadership oriented around this problem. Don't be afraid that they call it a CISO course. You know, you don't have to be a high level manager to, you know, to understand these things, but this is really the key and the ticket to having conversations at the executive side to get support so you can actually implement these programs. We also have a hyperlink here to, and in this course, they talk about a tool called Hyperproof. So I went through it. Let's go to the next slide. And we have a sample of.
Yeah, before we move to the next slide, I just added one, George, and I think your point is absolutely valid, but in the topic of the day, also very important, as I mentioned, also the cybersecurity requirements are increased, and for that reason, there's also the new cybersecurity training course, which is a perfect add-on to the CISO course. To get on topic on the current cybersecurity threat. So just a small break in on this slide, George. There we go.
No problem at all. And my apologies, I did see that when in the slide, and it just slipped my mind. So, yeah, so getting certified and getting trained, you know, in order to do those things, it's important for you to have those designations and that education. So this is where a compliance automation tool can come in handy, and since in the CISO certification course, this was the tool that was brought up. I went ahead and it was one of the many tools that we use in our practice. And this is the Hyperproof interface. And really, this is an example of what essentially is compliance automation at work. So we talk about how we have these certifications and these processes, how they cross-map to other frameworks. Automating that saves what essentially is a lot of pain and suffering from the auditing process, as well as in setting controls, because essentially you can load like a NIST CSF, in our case NIST CMMC, and you're going to have essentially an ISO. If you have an ISO 27001 and you're basically stacking those, then this tool automatically shows you what controls that you've done. And so now it's not always a luxury. Tools are a luxury, so it's not always in the budget. And so there's some of these courses will help in that regard if you're stuck managing in files and folders. But I think what you're going to see is that I mentioned that we have CMMC and ISO and other or more, and this is part of the problem, is that you're going to be dealt a set of other requirements that may come in that are privacy relevant. And so now all of a sudden you need controls for GDPR, and maybe you need controls for the 12 new state laws that are happening in the US, which are passing left and right. And so as new legislation happens and as regulatory frameworks change, these things update, and you'll find that you'll very quickly lose control of your own program and not be able to stay fresh on these things. So, because not all programs are necessarily a triennial audit like the CMMC. Next slide, please. So ultimately, here are your summary of actions. So this is not in any of your training documents. This is just by experience of literally the hundreds of different programs we've had that I've had to launch myself. And generally, you're looking at you're always looking for your gaps as well as looking at your risk management process. And this is where the ISO 27005 comes in handy. You have to understand from a risk perspective. You have to have context first. And that context is understanding the organization, because every organization is different. Even with CMMC, you're going to have certain things that you're doing and the way that you do things that you're going to have to understand how you're going to set your controls in place. So, and not every organization is the same. And we've dealt with small businesses that are struggling because they're maybe a machine shop, and so they may not have a lot of administration, yet they're the sub of the prime. In a CMMC situation, and they're being asked to do CMMC level 1 or level 2. Not exactly fair to them, because this is new to them, and so it's a struggle. And so from the perspective of understanding how you handle that risk and basically onboard the framework, which is your second step rather, really requires that you have good identification of that risk, you analyze that risk appropriately. Then you go through an evaluation and treatment process as well. And that is where the context establishment of understanding the external context versus the internal context of your organization. So remember, your external environment is where your organization is seeking to achieve your objectives, right? And that is essentially understanding what the culture, the social, logical, political situations that you're dealing with. And so you may have different ways that you have to deal with some of these controls. And then as you get into governance, that also is another function that you have to address. How are you going to prove that you're doing the right thing, especially when nobody's watching, right? And sometimes that's not always reasonable in a control. So by conducting a risk assessment and understanding and identifying those risks, and then applying the right risk analysis techniques. And remember, there's quantitative and qualitative. And you have to be aware of each of those concepts. So understanding those things and risk assessment and treatment is the most important step, because how you can onboarding the framework correctly, so you can address what I would call the ground war controls. So these are the controls that you're putting in place for ISO, as well as for CMMC or NIST or whatever it is that you're doing. And then the governance is actually within the long-term upkeep of the system. And we've learned that just keeping things in files and folders and going through that process manually isn't always reasonable. And believe me, there's open source tools out there as well. It's not just the GRC tool that I've demonstrated here per the slides from PCB, but you really do need to consider GRC to keep things fresh. For those of you that are smaller businesses, you might be working with IT managed service providers, or maybe you're the solo IT person, facing this. And I realize that not everyone's an expert. I want to make sure that I'm talking to you to say that, listen, reach out to your helpers. There are helpers, and I would argue that most businesses, at least in the U.S., if your revenue is below $1 billion a year, you're probably considered in terms of the way you administer and handle information security and handle IT, a small business, right? You're not scaled, and this is a whole new set of problems when you're looking at governance. So the GRC will help you, and I believe that's my last slide. So thank you everyone for joining us. Here's our emails, and we, of course, we'll have LinkedIn accounts as well, and we can hand it back over to PECB for Q&A. I didn't,
Thank you. Thank you, George, Dr. Oz, and Peter for delivering this highly informative webinar. Without further ado, we'll take some time to address questions from our attendees and audience. Let's begin with the first question. Some experts in Europe consider CMMC as an economic warfare tool. Do you agree with it, and what do you think?
Well, if you look at the model, there's quite some similar approaches. Of course, it's a model that has been initiated or driven by the Department of Defense. So in that aspect, there's a military approach to it. But on the contrary, if you look at the model, the maturity being required, the check items in the list. If you see that actually these requirements or maturity checks or controls are coming back in other non-military platforms and comparing it very simple to the NIST requirements, as I mentioned already in the introduction, I don't think it's fair to purely position it as a warfare model in that sense. It has been initiated as actually minimal security maturity requirements, I think, into that sense. And again, you will see the same requirements now popping up from the European NIS2 approach in that sense. I don't know how you look at it, George or us, but I think, in my opinion, personal opinion, it's not a warfare model in that sense.
I would agree with you, Peter. I think you just need to go back to really internet history to understand why we are where we are. You have to also be aware of the fact that, you know, when the internet was born, it was a DARPA project. So we have an internet because of DARPA, but peeling it out of what essentially was DARPA and privatizing the internet, which happened in the 80s. Fortunately, I was able to work with some of these people who did this early in my career. And they made it very clear that when it came to cybersecurity in general in this country, that that the issue of taking what essentially was ARPANET and the DARPA situation and putting the internet into private hands and commercializing it, that was the right thing to do, and to govern it separately through IETF and ICANN and some of these organizations. It's kind of globally governed now. But cybersecurity, they wanted to make sure it went into the hands of a scientific organization, which is why NIST is driving these controls. So this is NIST oriented intentionally, because the scientists who built the internet didn't necessarily want to see these controls come straight out of what essentially was DoD alone. And so the NIST function and the 800-171 is part of that. And some of these folks who built the internet are involved in some of these NIST initiatives today. So, you know, there's a balance, obviously, but I would definitely say that not a economic warfare from my perspective and what I've seen in the history of how this evolved.
Right, I would agree with both of you. What's going on is that, you know, this is the CMMC, the concept is a response to securing supply chain of the U.S. government and U.S. defense industry. So, you know, at this point in this scope, it's limited to DoD contracts, DoD projects, but it is expected to grow to other government contracts and projects. But there's really no specific guideline or requirement that, you know, the civilian industry are going to have to adopt this CMMC standard for cybersecurity. But, you know, that might be in future, but it's a natural response to the increasing number of cybersecurity threats.
Thank you. Another question is, who determines data classification and how the data classification is done for CMMC 2.0 certification purposes?
I can take that. Typically, you're going to see it in the contract in the first place. So basically, the project management office here in the DoD, they will define what's the applicable classification. Is it CUI? Is it FCI? If it is a CUI, is it a basic CUI or specified CUI? Because even CUI has different types. So like basic and specified. Specified is a little bit more complicated than basic because there might be some other regulations that apply to a dissemination and safeguarding of that particular information. So the prime contractors have to comply with those other standards, such other regulations such as export control, privacy laws, etc. So take a look at the marking, labeling on the documentations, main on the cover page. Distribution statement is very critical on the DoD contracts. That will be a rectangle box on the cover page, which will tell the prime contractors how to treat that information. So that's the #1 place that we should take a look. The issuing government agency is ultimately responsible of marking it correctly, the data.
I would agree with that. I think the bigger challenge is your contract manager doesn't always know. So when you're, especially if you're dealing direct as prime, and so how can you cascade that down to your subs without knowing that? And so that has been a lot of the delays for why perhaps some of these, if you're a sub and you're trying to figure out why your prime isn't moving, is because they're probably waiting on that information from the prime. And I've seen these situations where you have a prime and you have the sub of the prime and then the sub of the sub of the prime and so on and so forth. So these things do happen. And it takes a while sometimes to really understand it. So the smart thing to do is try to engage an RPO. That's a registered practitioner organization that has registered practitioners who, and this is basically for the CMMC and part of the Cyber AB initiative, that can kind of become your guide or your Sherpa as you go through the process, because they know how to press the right buttons to get that information, even if you're the sub of the sub of the sub sort of situation. And we've been in that, because I've been in that position personally a number of times.
Thank you. Someone has said, I heard that CMMC Level 3 certification could be a nightmare for European companies. Do you guys have any comments, or can you confirm this?
Level 3 for, I'm supposing the question owner was talking about the CMMC version 2, right? So level 3, which is the high valued sensitive CUI. So we are talking about the very critical sensitive projects. So if it's going to be nightmare, it's going to be probably for the foreign suppliers who are providing products or services to the US armed forces. And what happens is that they would receive some ITAR control stuff, information data, which would be also marked as the CMMC level 3. Yes, they can cause some disruption in that supply chain. There is no specific guideline for that from the DoD on how the foreign suppliers are going to be getting the CMMC level 3 at the moment. In fact, even we are in the comment period. The proposed rule has a comment period until the end of February, and after that, of course, there's a grace period, right? We are talking about around 12 months. So by the first quarter next year, we will start seeing in the contract, and we will see how level 3 specific questions would be answered in this 12 months. But currently, there's no guideline on that.
Yeah, I would equate nightmare to ITAR. So if there's an ITAR requirement, yeah, it could probably be a bit of a nightmare. So, and generally speaking, that's, I think, the concern that you have. And so I would definitely, this is when you want to be working with helpers. So because they're going to give you the guidance and give you methodologies and ways that you might be able to separate out or build enclaves obviously within an SSP and those sorts of situations. But you have to keep in mind that a lot of these controls that you're going to see, as long as you have those things in place, you're probably going to be able to get through this process. But yeah, when the ITAR component comes, and we've seen this many times, where you try to understand how do you get yourself out of that ITAR situation. But yeah, that's I would.
Yeah, I mean, again, multiple controls would apply. So there are solutions. There are solutions that foreign supplier can still be in the game by piggybacking to the other level 2 or level 3 certified companies here in the US, their systems, etc. Yeah, please get in touch with RPOs or the consulting organizations, maybe license training providers, C3PAOs. And also, if you have a large company, you're controlling a big major network, etc., and the stakes are big for you in this game, invest in also having one of your employees to attend to CCP training so that they can understand the CMMC in detail, so they could get certified for the CMMC as a certified professional.
Thank you, Dr. Oz. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, George. It has been a pleasure to have you as part of the panel for this webinar. Please be informed that this session is recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel, along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.